TS01 Sanders, who is a graduate of the ECA, the conservation course, before joining Simpson and Brown probably 1988. You were originally a painter into architecture, so you're talking so you've got 30 minutes and we'll give you the, as James said, we'll give you 3 minutes. Okay.
Of course, we have to respect the context of what we work with. And in a World Heritage Site, the idea of significance becomes very important to us. The significance can take two forms. We can look at the significance of the fabric of what is there, or we can look at the significance of the design. Now, the significance of fabric has become a kind of conservation orthodoxy since being championed by William Morris famously. But sometimes it's become there's kind of an unnecessary tussle between fabric and design, with often fabric winning out because it's actually easier to make decisions in favour of fabric. Quite often decisions in favour of fabric are safer than those of design. I think partly because in conserving design rather than fabric, you're depending on a kind of a sense of architectural history, which is less easy to trust than real fabric in front of you. Fabric is of interest to archaeologists. That's an archaeological to some extent, design should be championed by architects, and the history of architecture has to be the history of design. This whole process of design is largely how we look at the history of architecture. But for various reasons, very well described by Miles, there has been a reluctance among architects to champion the history of design and to champion designs which exist or could be respected or reinstated. Now, the reason for that preamble is that I have two examples here which I think illustrate, one, a fabric response, and the second is a design response, and that's the reason that they will look very different. This is the back of George Square, which we've just heard quite a lot about. And the west side of George Square is the side that survives. It's the bit that didn't get demolished by Robert Matthew. But, and the reason that my client here reckons that didn't happen is that the Dominican order, who owned these two houses, felt that they stood out against the university and didn't allow their buildings to be demolished. The Dominican order is also the Catholic chaplaincy for Edinburgh University, and it's also a very vibrant and successful church, St Albert the Great. Now, on the church, for slightly odd reasons, was on the top floor, or not quite on the top floor, but on the top floor of that bay window. And that made it very difficult to get to, particularly if you had problems with access, and it wasn't big enough. And our brief is to build a new church. To the bottom right are, well, to the left are part of our analysis of what is significant about the building. This is the analysis of different dates of construction or surviving fabric. We're actually looking at the basement level, missing out the ground floor level, and the first floor level where the church was. One thing that was exciting and interesting about that church was that it looked through that bay window into a garden. It looked towards trees. and that meant that there was a change throughout the year of different seasons, and that I think is exciting because it reflected the liturgical seasons. I felt there was a very nice dialogue between how the altar would be dressed for different parts of the year, and how the trees would be beyond it. So the bottom right are our very first sketches. I mean, these are very early days sketches, but they contain some ideas which continued as a response to the fabric here. Now, clearly, the back of these buildings is not designed. There's not much design context here. This is a fabric context. But one part of it which is designed is a line. There are two gardens for two townhouses, and there should be a line between them, which should be a wall. So one of the first decisions is to put a wall on that line, to respect that design. Other things that we wanted to do on the right are to place an altar in the middle of this garden. And this design is very much about taking the reaction between building a room and a garden in the original building and developing on that. So we wanted to place this altar in the middle and have views past it into the garden beyond. Now, part of this was because I've always had a bit of a wish to stick a cross in a garden and look at it from the church. So this is not an original idea. This comes from Ian Lindsay's chapel at Carberry Tower from 1965, which is a brilliant design solution. And this was almost my first thought. Let's have a building that looks towards a cross in a kind of natural sanctuary beyond the chapel. His idea wasn't original either because of the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm, and we know that Ian Lindsay had holidays in Sweden, and he can't have avoided going here, so we think that's where that comes from. Because I'm a painter, I'm not an architect, I missed the obvious example, which is the Talarando Church on the Water of 1988. And actually that makes me think that the cross in the garden would have been a bit of a cliche. So fortunately for me, we never got to put it in. But the whole design is based on a now invisible cross sitting in a garden. This is the design that was produced, and as you can see, it is a broadly contemporary looking design. Because this is fabric, we feel that this doesn't have to look like anything, but it does have to respond to its site. This was difficult to get through planning, and so it should be. It shouldn't be easy to put a building across the whole width of a Georgian house, and that should require a lot of justification. The justification here is a practical one, but I hope that quality of design helped that. And I should spring to Nancy Jimison's defence in that she did get this at an early stage and was helpful. We have the wall, which sits on the original line of the dividing wall between the two gardens, and the altar is the thing that should generate any church design, but generates this one by having a canopy around it, which in turn generates a roof form. You see that the altar is very obvious in that plan, sitting at the centre of that garden, with the basement of the original houses to George Square used as the ancillary accommodation for the church, and this allowed the upper levels to be used as the Dominican friary and a kind of tidying up of the uses of the building. Slightly against my wishes, we've got an ashlar wall there, where I kind of felt it should probably have been a rubble wall to respond to the garden. there's a lot of inside-outside going on here. So there we're looking at the altar, but we're also looking at a kind of canopy around the altar, which is half in and half out of the building. And to the right, you can see the invisible cross. Inside, in a way, quite a traditional thing to do with a church, to make a funnel towards an altar with a window beyond. The canopy around the altar is in fact a device to hold the roof up. But and we were designing a very historicist baldacchino for another church at the same time, and I think that this came up first as a structural device and then became a kind of proto baldacchino later. I think it's I very much like the way that a structural requirement has become a reference to something that has existed in churches since early Christianity. The porch is outside, so the porch becomes in a separate garden, so we've detailed this in a different way. The porch leads to a narthex, which centres on a statue of the Mother of God from the chapel, but the walls to the right can open up for larger, for times when there are larger events. I think a design has gone well when there are something fortuitous happens that you haven't anticipated. We always refer to these structural supports around the altar as trees. And when you come and see your building and something's happened that you didn't anticipate but actually adds meaning to it. And to see this near sunset, where our core 10 trees are casting tree-like shadows on the wall, that's completely fortuitous. We didn't design that. That just I'd love to claim that, but that's just good luck. The opposite side to this is what we do in a circumstance where design is the guiding force. There could hardly be a more designed space than Old College Court. Our aim for this is to just sort out the area within the court. It was long regarded as a problem. The university had a donor who wished to spend money making this area and paving it and making it better. In design terms, the history of this is more interesting than it appears. This is Robert Adams' 1789 design for Old College. Clearly different, and it's got two courtyards, professors against the Salisbury Bridge to the right. But only the yellow bits were completed by Robert Adam, leaving the university with quite a problem with a half-built building, and the blue bits were bits of pre-existing buildings which were left in place for a while. There it is, half-built with old buildings in it. It would have been very interesting if that had survived. Playfair's reworking of Robert Adams' design in following 1815 is really clever, because his brief is to make it into a single unified courtyard without incorporating Adams' bits, which were highly respected. And it worked very well, except for the rather steep slope across the site, which actually went across diagonally. And there were various attempts to try and solve that particular problem, some of them very short-lived, and there was terracing went in for about 3 years at one point. Here's our solution. And those are design drawings for it. Now, this is intentionally a modest approach. I want to avoid, I mean, it is an intervention, but I don't want it to look like an intervention. There's as much work has gone into this, and much more cost went into this than went into the chapel. But I think that it would be it just feels like architectural bad manners, whatever the theory is, to bring something new into this, or something that's detailed in a self-consciously new way into this space. I also have a bit of a beef about the way that pastiche, or the word pastiche, is used to me when I make planning applications. Pastiche is quite an important. We have 2,000 years of historical reference in architectural history, except for the last 100 years. But even that doesn't really apply to Scotland. Scotland has got a very, very honourable tradition or thread of architectural pastiche or historical reference running through its 20th century architecture. And even more than that, I think non-pastiche buildings, if that can be a category, are very much in the minority. The buildings that most people use, value, their houses, their places of leisure in 20th century Scotland have an element of, almost all of them have an element of historical reference to them. That doesn't make them good buildings, but it doesn't make them bad buildings either. And I think the problem we have is that not enough architectural quality has been directed at the buildings which are now dismissed as pastiche. And it's affecting our planning system because there's such a fear of pastiche. It's so often misunderstood as being obviously a bad thing that it's resulting in some bad decisions. And I've got one to show you now. Oh no, I don't, because beg your pardon. There is some fabric at Old College Court, but I'll rush through this because archaeology. Some very interesting archaeology turned up here, but including Joseph Black's laboratory and some chemicals in the ground, all mapped out. And that's not a bad example of pastiche either. But so we've got a World Heritage Site, and the character of this World Heritage Site is largely given to us, and certainly in Newtown, by whole design streets, palace fronts, as we heard from Richard before. Now, suppose in this World Heritage Site, the very first palace front, the very first overall scheme, existed as a design, not necessarily entirely as fabric. Shouldn't we work to protect it? Isn't that a really important thing? The palace scheme that comes before Robert Adams Charlotte Square, that goes before the whole of the new town, except for George Street. That strikes me as in a place where design and classical design is important. We should surely be protecting that. This is it. This is Robert Reed's, Robert Hayes' South Bridge scheme. Now, what's important about that? It's got to be design. It's not fabric. The way that those buildings have been extended upward, that's not important. But what's important about that is it's a design. It's also a very significant design historically because this design paid for the Old College Court, but by the money raised by the development. It's also it's a modest reworking of the Robert Adam design of the previous year, but it has a pretty exciting moment. It's a way of dressing up a great big bridge. It's really engineering mainly with some architectural facades around it. But it has these had these four elevations facing the Cowgate, which become kind of Pyrenean in their height around a bridge. Very exciting. There's the Robert Adams scheme. And I think had we had the Robert Adams scheme, we probably wouldn't have lost it. But it was redone as a cheaper scheme the following year. Now, Cowgate Fire, one of the major blocks where that design had been lost happened to be the site of the Carrowgate fire. Now, you can see the remainder of the gable on the end there, but you can see as a design it has been lost. As fabric, this was not terribly important, but it is on the site of a very important design. This is what's being built now. There it is. Now, I'm not wanting to be critical of this building as a design on its own. It's a perfectly okay bit of infill architecture that could go in any city in Britain. Be happy in Southampton, Norwich, Burnley, fine. It's in a World Heritage Site on the site of a really important design. It now means that that possibility of recovering that design is lost forever. And I think the reason it's been lost is that there's this nervousness about protecting and understanding the significance of design rather than fabric because of this nervousness about pastiche.